Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to Speaking of Cults, the new podcast titling for the same podcast I've been putting out for years about cults, about coercive control, about trauma, and about cult recovery. We cover in this podcast stories of abuse, and so this is a little bit of a trigger warning here for everybody listening at the beginning, that we are going to talk about stuff that's a little difficult to talk about and has some emotional, maybe baggage connected with it. And so that's what we're doing here today. And I am joined by Emily Ragland, and she is someone who has a master's degree. And I wrote this down to make sure I didn't get it wrong, in youth, family, and community sciences. Yep, excellent. And she reached out to me because she is someone who, like me, is interested in educating the public at large about the subject of trauma recovery, and how this sort of thing happens to us. And she is herself a trauma survivor. So, Emily, welcome to my show.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's be interesting. Now, you have, I guess maybe we should probably set up for the audience maybe a little bit more of your background. Who are you? Yeah. Where are you from? And what was it that sort of made you think, oh, yeah, Chris Shelton, that's a guy I should be talking to?
Yeah, fair question. Definitely a fair question.
So
I'm originally actually from and born in Ohio, but I quickly moved to Haiti in the Caribbean with my family. I lived there from when I was 5 till I was about 10. Then we moved to Florida. We lived there and my family still lives there. So I went to college here in North Carolina in Greensboro, which is just about an hour and a half from our capital, Raleigh. Mm-hmm. And then went back home, was there for a while, and then have been here now 8 years. And have a son and my husband. We met in college and he didn't want to leave and I wanted to be with him. So now I'm in North Carolina.
And there you go.
Yeah, that's how it works.
That is the nomad life of the American citizen.
There you go. That part. Yeah. So I learned about trauma, and now that I'm looking back more and more, I'm realizing I had far more traumatic experiences than I knew were traumatic experiences. I kind of chopped them up to just life as a brown girl. I'm raised by and adopted into a fully white family, and it makes a very unique experience for me. I just was never around people of color until basically college when I was 17. So I just didn't really know that the life that my family was living would not be the same for me as someone of color.
Oh, I get it. Let me ask you something, because in what you have said so far, I'm just not challenging. I'm just curious how this worked. You went to, obviously the picture that most people are going to get just because of racial biases is you say, you went to Haiti from 5 to 10 years old. Certainly I assumed Black family going back to Haiti or something like that, right? I mean,
right.
Duh. And now it's not that. And I have to, so kind of a cloistered experience there in Haiti?
Kind of like a mission, if you will. I mean, my family and I are not religious. Okay. But we went to a hospital that was founded by Albert Schweitzer, and he was big in hospital administration and a hospital building in particularly third world countries. So my father was a hospital administrator. My mom has been a fundraiser most of her career, as well as a social worker. So they took my sister and me, and we went to Haiti. And it was interesting because in Haiti, I was clearly not Haitian. Mm-hmm. And they used to call me what they say Blanc Rouge, which in Creole, which is the language of Haiti, means white red. So my sister and I, because she's also a person of color, adopted from a different family of color. And we were Blanc Rouge, where we were clearly not the white people, but also not Haitian.
Right.
And then I moved from there to the United States, and I immediately was Black.
Right.
There was no option but to be assigned, you are now a Black person.
Right.
And I was raised in a very upper class, very conservative school part of the state. It is a part of the world that I just don't relate to any longer. And I'm learning perhaps I never did. I think I just played the part and, enjoyed the benefits of it, but then learned later how really traumatic it was not being around anyone else that looked like me, never having a teacher that wasn't white, never being around a leader who wasn't white, just never being around anybody successful that was not a white person.
I get that. I totally get that. How interesting. And again, awesome, because I love having my biases and my stereotypes broken apart, right? So it's kind of awesome story. And so thank you for sharing that. And
yeah.
And I totally get the point, because, oh my God, right? Talk about stranger in a strange land in a way.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is no one around you who looks like you. And actually, yeah, that matters. So, so let's talk about that. What now, when we talk about trauma, and you're educated in this topic, and you want to educate others in this topic as well, as do I. So how do you, when you say, trauma and this kind of thing, I think some people might go, well, what are you talking about? It sounds like you had a great life.
Absolutely.
So what is the problem here? How do you see it as an issue?
Yeah, great catch, great point. So I have explained to people that trauma, unlike what we often think it is, it's not a singular event. It's not just an assault or a car accident or a house fire, perhaps. It can be ongoing issues as well as the lack of something. So for me, it was the lack of relatability. It was the lack of seeing people that looked like me who were successful or who weren't successful. I mean, just anybody, so that I knew that my life may not be the same as what I've been raised to expect. And there were many cases where I was hit directly in the face, if you will, with the realization that I was not them. Them being my friends, my family, my brothers, my extended family. I was not there. And so I lived a lot of moments that made me have to sort of stop and realize, oh, right, I'm brown. I'm not going to pass, if you will, in these conversations. I will be the one who, if I'm with my friends, people were walking behind me so I didn't steal things, or the cops have been called on me before because the assumption is that I'm brown and I'm in a nice place and I shouldn't be there. And that happened in my childhood to a point where I didn't realize it was trauma until I learned what trauma was and how we present those symptoms. And for me, I just ignored it and just sort of chopped it up to life as Emily. And as I learned more and more that these were microaggressions or straight up racist aggressions, and I became more cognizant that I had experienced far more trauma than I knew, because I had not only not been informed about what trauma was, but I also just got used to it, if you will. It just was part of life for me. And I just would be caught off guard and then laugh it off and keep it moving.
Right. Right. And not an unhealthy response.
Yeah.
In terms of that, right?
Yeah.
Certainly
and it's
better
typical.
Than,
I mean, we all, right.
Let's just say there are more negative trauma responses.
For sure. For sure.
Right. In terms of quality of life issues and things like that. Well, so let's go ahead and define this for people who might be thinking, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? Because I thought it had to involve something like injury, or, somebody assaulting you, or, you had to be in a war, or you had to be imprisoned, or, and sure enough, I mean, everything.
Those are all
certainly traumatizing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But these things are unique. They are individual, person to person. We all have different responses to things, right?
Yeah.
So how does this just like kind of through maybe a couple specific examples like you've given,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's not a microaggression when somebody's calling the police on you. That is
Right.
clearly, racist, race-based, different, like othering, right? It's like,
Right.
well, I can't trust you simply because of how you look.
Absolutely.
I know if somebody did that to me, I'd be furious. I'd be
Yeah.
absolutely furious, right?
Yeah. And I got used I mean, it happened multiple times enough that it was like, come on. And I would say, call my dad. He's the guy you need to talk to. And they knew him. He was kind of a big deal in our area. So, it was like, oh, you're his daughter. Okay.
Oh,
Um, right, exactly. Like, oh, our bad. It's like, yeah, no big deal that you surrounded me with 4 cop cars at 11 o'clock at night while I'm with my friends.
right.
Um,
Come on.
so yeah, trauma can be all of those things you listed,
Yep.
but they can also be, and the challenge with trauma is, like you mentioned, is very individual. I can't tell you what is trauma to you, and you
Right.
don't get to tell me what was traumatic to me. And that makes the conversation increasingly challenging because I get a lot of people who say, well, I lived through X, Y, and Z and I didn't have a problem.
Mm,
Or we were in the same family and I didn't handle it the way they did. But that is totally up to the individual, their mental health, the way they were raised, how they identify. All of those things have variables that really matter in the conversation of trauma.
yeah,
And it's
exactly.
tough because we don't talk about it. We don't talk about trauma. We talk about, maybe if we're lucky, mental health, but even that conversation is minimal. So I think it's important that people know that trauma can be any experience, any situation, any event or lack of events. So, like, neglect is trauma, um, where it impacts you almost forever and always. It impacts your mental health, your feeling of security, your feeling of safety. And trauma is very much related to all of those things. And if you have experienced trauma, often the process to fight and work through it may come up in ways that you're not prepared for because it will inevitably make you deal with it one way or another. And
Exactly.
oftentimes, because we don't know anything about trauma, we're not ready for it. It just slaps you in the face, and now you have to figure out what this is and what to do with it.
Exactly. And in fact, I thought it might help if we clarified. I pulled up this definition. You can tell me what you
Perfect.
think of this.
Yeah,
Because this is just one of many that you can Google, you can check this out.
absolutely.
But there's a key point about this, right? Which is trauma is an emotional response to an intense event that threatens or causes harm. The key there is it's an emotional response. It's something that's generated within you. It's not the event,
Right.
it's within you. It's how you're
Correct.
responding to an event, how you're reacting to an event. And it's often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that
Yep.
exceeds one's ability to cope with or accept the emotions involved with that experience. And
Yeah.
right, because that's the point. It's our reaction to it. Well, guess what? We all react things differently. What you find
Yeah.
funny, I might not find funny. So
Absolutely.
if you were to stigmatize somebody or um, other them, let's say,
Yeah.
right, because they had a different sense of humor than you did, that would be crazy. That'd be
Yeah.
absolutely nuts. Nobody would, it'd be like, what? You didn't laugh at my joke, so get the hell out of my life and never return, right? Like that would be a crazy response. And
Right.
yet, if somebody responds differently emotionally in a negative way to an
Yeah.
event, and we don't, we will, like you were just describing, will tend to, well, what's your problem? Right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So just to clarify the exact thing we're talking about, it's
Yeah.
this inner thing. And this is, I think, why emotional intelligence and
Mhm.
understanding some of the basics, at least, of the psychology of this can
Yeah.
really, really help us identify and even make it, I hope, eventually, if with enough understanding of this and enough kind of self-awareness, I think it's possible that we could gauge or monitor or observe our reactions in the moment and moderate that to some degree
Yes.
if we have some power of choice in the matter, right? Now, obviously not when somebody's sitting there punching you in the nose, but to otherwise maybe less,
Yeah.
physically destructive events. What do you think about everything I'm just kind of soapboxing about there?
100% accurate. And I think that it includes why the conversation's maybe not had, and if it is had, that it is so murky,
Yeah.
is, I think as a society, we like black and white, literally. Like, we like to know one or the other. We don't live in the gray area so well. And trauma is only the gray area. There is no black or white because, like you said, it's relative. It's all based on how I interpret it, how I feel about it, which is why people may say, like, it's not that big of a deal. All I did was blah, blah, blah. But for you, it like broke a part of your soul. And when you speak up, people often don't see that it is different to each human. So you don't get to tell me it wasn't traumatic. I don't get to tell you it wasn't traumatic. And I
Okay.
think our desire to tell people how they should feel makes the conversation of trauma even more challenging because we want to say, come on, we had it worse. At least you weren't attacked by a fire hose when you were, in the 70s and had dogs biting your ankles.
Right.
Absolutely. That sounds horrific. But I still have microaggressions, literal actual aggressions. And so, to your point, I think also we get sort of stuck in this trauma comparing.
Right.
And
Right.
I often tell people, just like they say, comparing is what is it, that robs you of happiness.
Right.
That's the same with trauma, is if I sit there and say, oh my gosh, Chris had it so much worse than me, I should be grateful that I wasn't in the situation he was in. So, at least I blah, blah, blah. Luckily, I da, da, da. And that's where I find that conversation of you should be grateful to be detrimental in some cases,
Mm,
because I'm all for being grateful that I have what I have. But I don't think it should negate how hard it was to get where I am in order to get those things.
that's right.
And so when we talk about trauma, I tell people often we can enjoy what we have and still also acknowledge how hard it was to get where we were.
Exactly. Exactly. I think I wonder if that isn't springing out of, how we sort of try to deal with it within ourselves, and then we vocalize it and then it becomes a kind of trauma Olympics or oppression Olympics,
Right.
right? Of mine is better than yours or mine is greater than yours or something. And
Yeah.
objectively speaking, fine. Sure, you could look at somebody who is a concentration camp survivor or an RPF
For
survivor
sure.
or a, Guantanamo Bay survivor and go, holy shit, this person went through some shit, right? But
Yes.
but in what way does that person's experience in what universe does that experience in any way negate or lessen your experience in your own life, right? It shouldn't. These are
100%.
two different things, and we can look at
Yeah.
them, separately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Certainly. Yeah. Sorry, my voice cracking here. Yeah, I'm going to use that edit button.
Right? Beep.
But certainly, from a therapeutic point of view or from a therapy point of view, right? This is a very, very important view to have.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, just to go to the other end of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Because we're heavily acknowledging that the relativity of this, the individualness of this, right? There also seems to be a point, just to have this part of the conversation, where I have
Yeah.
observed, and certainly as a child, I did this, overusing or knowing
Yes.
using a traumatic episode or something that maybe actually didn't hurt you as much as you might now say it does. And we get that
Yeah.
end of it too, which can, in a way, it's perfectly organic and natural for kids and stuff like that to do that. But when it gets to adults doing that, I think we are doing a real disservice to trauma survivors.
Yes.
By
Yes.
exaggerating it too. And you get that sort of, I hate this word, but I don't know what word right now in the moment to use. You get that vibe off
Yeah.
the person, right?
Yeah.
How does that factor into your sort of interpretation or perception of how trauma exists in our society and how we're dealing with it.
Yeah, I think it's similar to when I hear people say, oh, she's crazy, and they're not mentally ill, or
Right.
oh, she's so depressed, and she's not necessarily depressed. She might be sad, she might be tired. But I think that misunderstanding of the word can really take away from those who do live through what that actually is. And
Right.
like you've shared, it's not necessarily to say, oh, only we get to use that word because you didn't actually survive through anything.
Right.
But I do think that there's a connotation involved where we could easily say everybody had hard times. Was it a trauma? Some of it might be, some of it might not be. Is
Mhm.
it something that now that you look back 20 years later, it still hits your heart? Or is it something that in the moment was challenging, scary, overwhelming, stressful, and then, you got over it and you didn't have to go to therapy for it for 20 years? So I think that's where the difference is as well, is we have to be able to acknowledge things can be hard, but that doesn't always mean that that experience was a trauma. And
Right.
I think that it's quick for people to have that slide all of a sudden where everything's a trauma.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case. So being trauma aware and being trauma informed allows us to tell people, we see that you're struggling through something and we want to meet you where you are without judgment, without preconception,
Yeah.
and you get to tell us what has happened and how it made you feel, versus us coming in and saying, you experienced X, Y, and Z. You now have X, Y, and Z. Your diagnosis is A, B, and C. And so I get to tell you what you need to do now. And
Right.
I think that's where the power gets taken away from many of us as survivors, is we don't have the clinical knowledge to say, no, I don't want to go through it in that direction, or I don't want to expose myself that way yet. And
Right.
to find other options to recover can be really tough, because therapy requires you to confront some things that maybe you weren't ready for or you didn't know about. And ideally, you're with a therapist who will help you go through that journey safely.
That's right.
But there are many therapists out there who push too fast or who aren't trauma informed. And it's very easy to trigger someone into something that could be far worse than when they got to a therapist. And I've had experiences with that as well. And it's
Mm.
it's horrifying because you trust in a professional. And when they mistreat you and mistreat that trust, it makes you have nowhere else to go.
Yeah, it is definitely rough, because it puts you into the therapist shopping, you know,
Yeah, which is
because it's like,
miserable.
oh, I hated that. I hated that, right?
Oh,
Trying to find the right
yes.
person that you can connect with, who's going to treat
Right.
you right and all that. Because there's so, and and to be fair, of course, people are trying their best, but sometimes there's just not matching up. There's
Yes.
personality clashes. There's this, there's that. There's just everything you run into with people, but but there are
Yes.
bad therapists out there.
There are.
There are. There are. They will violate their ethical boundaries. They will violate treatment modality
Yeah.
methodologies, right? They'll spin their own shit. They'll do their own stuff. They'll enter other arbitrary ideas like religion into the session.
Yes.
Your problem is you just haven't accepted Jesus yet. I really wish that was not as big of a problem as it was, guys, but it is
Yeah.
a huge problem. So
Huge.
those kind of things have exist, and we have to acknowledge that, because when you're a trauma survivor looking for help and you run into that, it ain't help.
No.
you know it's just
No.
judgment, and
Yeah.
that's not what anybody wanted. So
Right.
okay, so let me ask you about this now in terms of
Yeah.
trauma, because there's another thing that occurs to me, which is, I think, an easy way for people to misunderstand the experience when they observe it in others. When somebody else has had a traumatic experience or is carrying that around with them, there will be an awful lot of, at least in my experience as a cult member for years, decades, in fact, there was just active suppression
Mm.
of all the trauma, right? You just bury that shit. You just bury it and bury it, right? Because you're not allowed to experience, you're not even allowed to call it what it is.
Right.
We see this also in survivors of traumatic episodes, whether one-off or complex episodes of this. They just want to suppress it, throw it in the closet, shut the door, never think about it again, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then one day,
Yep.
right, it all comes out, or it starts, you know, something
Yep.
triggers, and boom,
Yeah.
everybody's going, "What the hell happened to Bob?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to speak about that suppression release factor of this?
Yeah.
Because
Absolutely.
that can be
That's a great,
misinterpreted.
yeah, that's a great point. And I think much of my own experience speaks to it as well, is my family was just not one that talked about emotions very often. We were more of a shit or get off the pot kind of family. So if you were going to have a concern, what are you doing about it? If you're not able to do anything about it, I don't want to hear it, because what am I supposed to be doing about it?
Right.
So because of that, I often didn't understand the emotions that were trying to communicate to me. Hey, we're not okay. Hey, we don't feel safe. Instead, I would just say, just part of being Emily, and off we go. And so when we suppress it to the point that many of us do, whether it's because people don't open up space to have the conversation, we don't have the words to have the conversation, we didn't even know it was a conversation, we often will struggle, but knowingly ignore the struggle. So it may pop up and we say, not yet, we're not ready, we're not ready. Or I don't have time to deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have time. I'm a parent or a caregiver, or I'm in school, and I don't have time to open up this can of worms because I have life to live and things to do. And so sometimes we suppress it on purpose because we don't have the bandwidth, the time, the ability to address it. And sometimes we suppress it because the social norms expect that we suppress.
Correct.
That's just how things are.
Yep.
When we say things like man up, or, men don't cry, or we make fun of people who cry who identify as male, that gets to that really icky point of, well, then how am I supposed to release this energy and this sadness or anger or hurt, and not hold it in with my chest out until all of a sudden something small happens and I lose my mind, and now I quote overreacted. And so when we suppress, I tell people a lot of times, it's not that it goes away. It's just that we're ignoring it, and it will bubble up one way or another. It's going to appear. And many people might be able to be fortunate enough to say, now I'm ready. But oftentimes, many of us don't even know it's bubbling to the extent that it's been bubbling. And now all of a sudden the top pops, the volcano's there, and all the feelings come out. And again, normally not in a place where it makes any sense.
Right.
So it's not in a place where it's like, oh, I'm in therapy, this is why it's happening. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm in a restaurant and someone smells like that one person, and all of a sudden I can't be in public for 20 weeks because everything makes me think of that event.
Right.
And that's where it gets really challenging, is the suppression. So I often tell people we need to start talking about emotions with everyone at the youngest of ages, whether they're male, female, non-binary, whoever it is. It's not about gender, it's not about orientation, it's not about sex or any of that. It's the part of being human. And if we ignore it, the humanness of what we are will confront us one day or the other. And if we talk to people about feelings and give them space to learn how to express the feelings, then we don't hopefully have those moments where, oops, all of a sudden I'm in the grocery store bawling and someone has to come pick me up because, that one guy looked like that one person from that one place.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's wild. It's wild how it will do that.
Oh, yeah.
It's not like, it's funny. It's just funny how we play the whole free will thing. And we do. And fine, we have responsibility, we have choices, all of that. But I'll tell you, man, your emotional responses, you can just forget it. That is not under your control.
No.
They come up. And when they do, you got to deal with them. And you can deal with them in a healthy way, or you can deal with them in an unhealthy way. And
Yeah.
I just don't know another way to say that, in terms of emotional intelligence. You just got
Yeah,
an awareness of this.
absolutely.
So, because this is so tied in with with trauma and all of that,
Yeah,
we've been talking in general terms about the phenomena of it and how people experience it and how they suppress it. Now, you have a story,
I do.
and I would like maybe that we get into that phase of our
Yeah.
talk now. What happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So my story starts in college. I went to school here in North Carolina at a Quaker college. I
Oh
know
boy.
nothing of Quakers then. I know very little about Quakers now. It just happened to be founded by Quakers. And what they stand for is typically justice, equity, inclusion, having very equal voices. And that spoke to me a lot because I had not been at the table, if you will, in any part of my life until then.
Mm,
And so decisions had been made for me. I was an athlete, decisions were made for me. I was, of course, a child to two parents, decisions were made for me.
sure.
I worked, decisions were made for me. I was a class president, I made decisions, quote, but ultimately decisions were made for me. And so I had never really been in a place where I could make my own choices and actually learn what that feels like. And so the opportunity to be in a physically small as well as very low number college, I think it was like 1,300 for the full college.
Wow. That is small.
Um, yeah, like my graduating class, I think was like 400 something. My high school graduating class was 53. So I've always been in very small, intimate spaces, which has made this for me more challenging because it also means I'm always being watched. It felt like I was
Hmm.
the brown person.
Sure.
And in my childhood, it didn't just feel that way. I was literally in living experiences where people would be like, well, what do you think? What are your thoughts? Or Emily, what do they do in this situation? And it was like, not only am I not speaking for everyone, but I don't even live what I would say is a typical person of color life because I'm living with all white people.
Right.
So it was just one of those moments where I felt like I wanted to be in a space where there were people of color. I wanted to be in a small school because my schools had always been teeny tiny. And I wanted to be somewhere where I could sit at the table and be heard and seen and valued. So I also wanted to be an African American studies major, and not surprisingly, in the South, there's like two options. So I'm sure that's not much more now than then, sadly enough.
No, it wasn't that long ago. No, we're not. No, we're not talking ancient history here, folks.
Right,
Your
exactly.
degree was in 2020, right?
So my undergrad
Your
degree
undergrad
was
degree was. Yeah.
I graduated in 2007.
Oh, okay, so we're going back to that. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
Thank you for clarifying that because I wasn't sure about the sequence of things there.
yeah, thank
Cool,
you.
cool. Yeah, still
Yeah,
not
so
ancient
for
history.
undergrad,
Still
yeah,
not ancient history.
yes. So I
Oh.
had two options because I don't like the cold. I didn't want to be too far from my family. So I was like, Virginia's the most north I wanted to go. There were two colleges that offered African American studies. So I picked one of them being this one. And I wanted to play softball because I had played softball and travel ball for most of my high school and middle school career. So I was going to play softball. I was going to major in African American studies. And I was going to be a person for the first time who had some choices and decisions to be able to make.
Yep.
So
Which
I
is
went to
which is
college
which is I think how a lot of people would characterize going
for
to
sure.
college, right?
Yes.
Fair enough, right?
Yes.
But points taken on, you having a rather unique experience, right?
Yeah.
That's undeniable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this increasingly difficult sometimes to explain is like you just said, there's just so many layers and variables.
exactly.
So, everybody goes to college a little excited, a little nervous, a little ready to like make bad decisions and learn through those things and so I think there was for sure that same excitement for me of like I'm finally away from my family but not too far and I finally get to like learn things, but I still have the comfort of like playing ball, which has always been very safe and very much like my home space. And so I get to college a little bit early because they had like pre-orientation where like freshmen could get there and like learn where their classes are and meet some people. So I did that. And then in 2000, this is in 2003.
Mm.
So I did that, and then school started. I was on the softball team. I was registered for classes. I was ready to get going. I went to a Halloween party, and it changed the rest of the trajectory of my life from there out. Um, it was, a typical college party. It
Mm-hmm.
was October, and despite it being chilly, I'm sure we all wore, as little as you could. You wanted to look cute, or some people wanted to look funny. My college was crazy liberal, so there were a lot of people who were just flat out naked. Like it just happened all the time. You just saw naked people all the time.
Wow.
And so,
That was not what I
yes,
expected you to say. Wow.
it was
Whoa, what?
all the time. Very hippie. There was times in Christmas, I think it was, where they would have like a run through all of the libraries and everyone was naked. Like it was just part of the vibe there.
Okay.
And with that, I felt like it also presented itself to be particularly safe because if you're walking around naked, clearly you feel safe to do so.
I mean,
And
yeah.
so I thought, great, this is a place again where they're advertising that we are going to watch out for each other. We've got your back, you've got ours, all those things.
Right.
So I went to the college party in the apartments, and they were serving what's called or was called jungle juice, which was whatever you could get a hold of that was alcoholic. You'd pour into a bathtub with maybe some juice, and everybody would just sort of scoop it up and be about their business.
Yep.
And someone
That sounds
gave me a
pretty
cup.
typical college.
Exactly. Like whoever has the ID, you get what you can and pour it in and share with everyone.
Yep.
So I got a cup from someone who I had seen but didn't necessarily know. We were both freshmen.
Mm.
He handed me the cup. I had seen other people take a cup as well, and so I didn't even think twice about it. And then I think that was probably maybe midnight or so on Halloween. And I woke up the next day in his room naked at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Wow. Passed out for what's that?
10 and a half, 11 hours.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
sort of guessing the worst happened.
Yes.
Okay.
So I wake up naked. I had been a virgin. I very much had sort of protected that. I have zero judgment for anyone who is sexually active. If you're safe and it's consensual, I'm all for everyone making their own decisions. But I had decided to just hold off until I felt like it was someone I cared for.
Mm-hmm.
And so I woke up and it felt odd that I would be in a room with a stranger, naked, with a naked person next to me, in a room I'd never been in at a school I just have been in for like a month and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And so initially I thought, well, like I woke up and it was just like, what just happened? Like I
Mm-hmm.
have zero recollection. The last thing I remember was moments where I could recall being basically dragged across campus by this person.
Mm.
And he is physically smaller than me. So clearly, I also realized like I probably was drugged. Something didn't seem right. I only had that one cup of drink. I hadn't drank a lot in high school, but enough that I knew that like one cup shouldn't probably knock me on my butt like it did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I woke up. He was still there from what I can remember. And the challenge for me is there's huge parts I don't recall and may never remember for those 10 hours.
Sure.
There are portions that I have slowly started to remember, and it has felt like an out of body experience, which I later learn is what is it when you remove yourself basically from what's happening?
Yeah, disassociation.
Disassociation. Yes.
Yeah.
So I later learned I disassociated, and I remember watching myself being raped for who knows how long.
Right.
So I wake up, I collect all my clothes in a total confusing mess of like, what the fuck just happened?
Yep.
He's there. He's not really saying anything or telling me anything either, of course. His
Mm.
roommate's there. There's people there. So
Wow.
yep.
Ugh.
So I get up and leave
Mm-hmm.
and walk my way back to my dorm and do what you do, which I now know you shouldn't do. You shower, you scrub, you get all the ick off of you. I washed my clothes and I just went about my life. I had no clue what had happened. I thought maybe he liked me. Maybe this is like a thing. Maybe he and I are going to be something. And I later went to class and remembered slash realized he was in two of my classes. And so in that time frame over the next couple days, week or so, we're in class together. He's asking me to sit next to him. He's talking to me. So I'm thinking it's not typical of me that I would have done this, but maybe this is something. So, okay, maybe this is like a guy I'm interested in and he's interested in me. So we exchange numbers. We're talking and texting a little bit. This is 2003, so you talk after 9 and text minimally. But we're communicating. We see each other on campus, in class, etc. And then one day I get a knock on the door, and it's his roommate. And I was like, "What's going on, Andrew?" And I knew of him. He was a rugby player. The rugby guys were always fun. They always were the life of the party. So I knew of him. And he was like, "I need to tell you something. You need to sit down." And I was like, "Oh God, what happened?" And he's like, you need to call the cops. You probably need to go to the doctor. You were raped." And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, "Yeah, I was there. And many of us were there. And you were screaming no. And you were trying to fight him off. And you were raped all night. And you need to probably call the cops and you need to go get checked because I don't know if he has any diseases or anything or if he even uses a condom. Like I don't know. So you need to go to the hospital."
Oh my
And
God.
immediately I just I had no words. Like, not only am I finding out I was assaulted, but I'm finding out that this person and others just let it happen for
Right?
10 hours.
Like, how is it that this guy's just standing there this whole time and now comes and tells you days a week later? What?
Yes. So
I mean, thanks. But
I,
what the fuck?
exactly. It
Right?
was like, how is this help? Like, I almost prefer you have not told me so that I didn't have to really address this.
Right?
And now here I am, not only addressing the fact that I've been raped and drugged, because he was like, "Yeah, he slipped something. He told me he slipped something in your drink. I
Uh,
know for a fact you were drugged." And I was like, "How is this helpful to show up now when you could
right.
have shown up and pulled him off of me or called the cops then?" Now it's been a week. I've washed my body dozens of times. I've cleaned the clothes. Like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Hmm.
And I had never even heard of rape until I got raped. Like, I didn't even know people did that to each other.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't know sex could be non consensual. I had never heard of it. I always just thought you, two people have sex. Well, two people have sex and they make that decision and they do so.
Right.
I had never even known that people would force each other or force themselves on other people.
Wow.
And
So
so
unfortunately,
then,
I'm sorry. So am I right then that your parents never had a conversation with you about the concept of consent
no,
or any of that?
none of it.
Wow. Or
I don't think I even had a conversation about sex. I remember being given a book and I remember bringing the book to school and not knowing that it was like something you don't bring to school and I got in trouble and went to the principal's office and I got suspended. And I didn't know that you don't do that because it was brought to me so nonchalantly that it was just like, here's a book, read about your body. And that was it.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I didn't have sex ed because I went to a Christian school where, God forbid, we talk about sex because abstinence is the best answer. I'm saying that sarcastically.
No. Yeah.
So I just had no understanding of any of this.
Oh
And
my
so here I
God.
am, 17,
Yeah.
in my dorm, learning that I'd been raped, learning that rape exists, learning people drug each other. I didn't know that was a thing either. And now I have to go to the hospital and call the cops.
Right.
So I was a freshman. I didn't have a car. I had to find someone with a car because that was, of course, before, Uber and all those. I had to find someone with a car to take me to the hospital. I went to the emergency room. They dropped me off by myself. I went into the emergency room by myself, sat there for hours until I was finally seen, to be told, well, it's too late to do a rape kit. If anything, we could maybe know you had sex, but we couldn't confirm anything other than that.
Right.
So then comes, well, what do you want us to do? We can have the cops come, we can have an advocate come, and we'll take it from there. And I was like, okay, if that's what you do, then that's what we'll do. And so the cops came. There were two males. The first things they asked me were, where were you? And I told them I was at college on a campus for school drinking. And they said, why were you drinking? You're underage. I could press charges for you underage drinking. What were you wearing? Why did you take a drink from a stranger? It's college. Everyone is a stranger. And why did you wait so long to say anything about it?
Right.
All are the worst things you can ask a survivor of an assault.
Yeah.
And all are things one would hope that cops, particularly, are educated in knowing better to not ask.
Apparently not in Virginia.
No. So
Plus, this
I'm
is just
sitting
classic
there
fucking
being
bullshit.
asked all these horrible accusatory questions.
Yep.
They basically are like, it's your word against his. And I was like, no, it's not. I know someone you can ask who will tell you what happened. He's the one who told me what happened. And that's why I'm here. I didn't even know what had happened.
Yep.
And so they say they'll go talk to this person. What's his name? I give them his name. And they're off to go do that. And then the advocate's supposed to come. And, advocates come for people who have been sexually assaulted, children who perhaps have been mistreated or abused. They never come. No one ever comes. So I just frantically get dressed and done and call my ride and go back to school. And in the midst of this, at some point, I had called my parents, who immediately got in the car and drove from Florida to North Carolina. So they were there like the next day.
Wow.
And I just remember them having to pick me up and put me in their rental car because I couldn't walk. I couldn't do anything. And I sat in their hotel room in a ball for like 3 days. Now, meanwhile, I'm missing classes because classes have started. So my parents were communicating with the school about classes and, what my options would be, if I'm able to return, if I felt safe or not, if I didn't, what are my choices? How do I transfer if I wanted to transfer? Just what are the choices here?
Yeah.
And the school basically was like, well, it's his word against hers, so like we're not gonna do anything about it. Like, she has classes, she can go to her classes. So I go to my classes.
Wow.
And I refused to go to my classes initially because he's in my class. So I'm telling my parents, and they're talking to the school, and they're like, well, we're not going to send her to class when the man who assaulted her is in 2 of her classes.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to come up with a solution for that. And the school solution was to make me drop my classes.
Of course. Heaven
So
forbid we
I
should
was
inconvenience him in any way.
that part. So I was either allowed to leave or I could basically not go to class, but continue learning on my own and meeting with the professors individually if and when they were able / willing to do so.
Right.
So I did that. I stopped going to 2 of my classes. I had to schedule times with my professors to meet. I had to learn all the content on my own. I had to do all these things so that I could get the credits for the classes I was in and not waste. I mean, also, I hadn't mentioned this yet. The school was like $34,000 a year. So for me not to waste 16 grand on the semester, basically,
Yeah.
I had to do something.
Right.
So I maneuvered somehow and continued to learn. I quickly realized I couldn't play ball anymore because we traveled to different states and all over North Carolina. And when I was out of my safe space, I was having horrible panic attacks, horrible nightmares. So I had to quit softball, which really super sucked because that was one of the only groups of community I had. Between that and the people in my class, who I also no longer got to see because I was no longer going to class. And so basically, I sat in my dorm for the next 3 months by myself, going to the office to meet with these professors, doing my work as well as I could. And that was how it was handled. And then for the next 3.5 years, I continued going and he continued being there as well.
So this other person who had informed you did not step up to testify or submit an affidavit or something?
So the cops asked him and he said I made it all up and I was crazy.
Oh, for crying out loud. That's disgusting.
And at that point, it was my word against his
Right.
word, and it was a wash.
Yep.
And this person also was at the school for these next 3 years of my life. And I saw him on the regular. I saw both of them almost every week, at least a couple times.
Wow.
So I spent the next several years being in college, but not really living the college life because there were a select few that I felt safe around. There were a select few places that I wanted to go. I didn't want to be in crowds. I didn't want to party around groups. And so it was tough.
Yeah. Yeah. And completely unnecessary. All of it. Right. It's been so hard over the last 20 years watching universities fumble their way through trying to figure out how to deal with this.
Yes.
Because it is such a difficult, complicated mess when it's he said, she said. And, you want to believe victims, right? You want to believe
absolutely
others. And yet, there's both sides of this thing, and it's just a mess. And watching each campus screw around with this, right? And go too far one way, go too far in the other, just not sensibly dealing with this is really been frustrating, just from a distance, from what I've been watching for the last 10 years now. So you made it through this thing. This guy didn't obviously get prosecuted. There was no justice for you in this. It was traumatizing to finding out about the whole damn thing. So what was your path following this?
Yeah. So like we initially hit on, I went to therapy, my first therapist. I found one that was close because I didn't have a car. So I was like, let's find one that I can walk to.
Sure.
I went there. I explained what had happened. And I find out he is religious. And he tells me God only gives us as much as we can carry. And that this was a lesson I was destined to have to learn this way.
Oh my God.
And that
your rape was important for your own personal spiritual progress?
Yeah.
Wow. Like that's what I'm talking about. Like
Yep.
just be quiet rather than say crap like that to a trauma survivor.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So I didn't go to therapy the first 5 years or so of my recovery.
Yeah.
You know, like you said, I mean, you get one bad taste, especially
Yeah.
when you finally got the balls to address it. You finally are in a space where you can finally be vulnerable. You're finally ready to say, all right, this is probably going to bring up some shit, but I need to address it. And then when you're met with something like that, I'm not, I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to handle any of this then if I can't even be respected when I come to a professional about the conversation.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so I handled it in the worst other ways. Well, not worse, bad ways. I turned to drugs and would smoke pot regularly. I drank a good bit to ignore all of this and function what I thought was functioning, get through it. And I got really promiscuous. And I'm finding, and this gave me relief, but I'm finding now over the last 10 years that those are all common ways that people handle an assault.
Yep.
I initially did not know any of that. So I was like, what's wrong with you? Like, why would you be doing these things when you already can't trust people? Why are you opening yourself up to be taken advantage of? And so, um, college happened. I, survived it. I graduated with a 3.5. I, got my bachelor's and I have a master's in philosophy and a minor in African American studies. I only got a bachelor's in philosophy because the only professor on the campus that ever believed me was a professor of philosophy. And she was my advisor and the only person that would give me leadway when I was struggling. So if I was up all night panicking, she was kind enough to say, you can take your time and get me the assignments. And so it was really just that she made me feel safe. And so if I could take as many of her classes as I could, then I would. And so I became a philosophy major.
Wow.
But she advocated for me. She was the only one who would email people, and she'd email professors until I graduated saying, I know that it may seem like Emily is trying to avoid something, but you need to know without me breaking her confidence, she needs extra time. She will do her part. She will respond appropriately. She will get things to you, but you will need to give her space and time on occasion to do so.
Mhm.
And if it wasn't for her, I for sure wouldn't have graduated.
Right. Right. That is the
So,
importance of advocacy, folks.
yes,
Right. If this is a
yes,
new term for you, you might want to go look it up.
yes,
It's an important concept. And it's and everything Emily is saying here about this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I thank her to this day. I tell her, I speak of her on the podcast I've been on. I really not only do I think I wouldn't have graduated, I probably would have killed myself. Like there were many days where I thought anything would be better than this. I watched everybody else enjoy college. I watched everybody else go out and go to the clubs and go to the bars and date and do all these things. And I honestly, for most of the years, couldn't leave my room because I might see him or I might see the other guy, or just being in groups would make me panic. Being around drunk people would make me vomit. Like I would physically get ill and I couldn't handle it. So most of those 4 years, I didn't do anything. I just would go from my room to my two best friends' room and back. And that was it.
Wow.
So then after that, the first job I got, I worked at a domestic violence shelter.
Hmm.
I had worked with youth for much of my own childhood. I was always the YMCA camp counselor and, all those things. So I ran the youth department for the domestic violence shelter for about a year and a half, 2 years. And it was invigorating to be an advocate for those who didn't have advocates.
Yeah.
It also was incredibly challenging to watch people not be able to get out of their unsafe spaces.
Right.
Um, I think domestic violence is one thing that we don't respectfully address. We assume people can just leave.
Oh,
Statistically, it takes 9 attempts for someone to leave.
yes.
And even then, they get often killed in the effort to do so, and their children get mistreated or go to the system.
That's right.
So it was a really eye-opening moment for me to realize. Initially, I had gone to school to be an attorney. That was my goal when I went to this school, was to do this and then go to law school. And I quickly learned, not only is the law a piece of shit and it basically means nothing because it doesn't actually help anybody in most cases, but that I had an opportunity to use my experiences to maybe be more of a advocate, um, a mediator, someone who could help others who didn't know how to use their voice or didn't ever get told they could use their voice, or their voice looked or sounded different than the stereotypical voice. And so I spent most of my career actually working with individuals with autism,
Hmm.
um, often who are mistreated also in ways that are just horrific. I worked in group homes, I've run foster systems, I've run many of these opportunities where I was continually exposed to trauma, really.
Yeah.
And that's where I started learning trauma was a thing. Was I did my first trauma informed training as a group home director, and it was eye-opening. And it felt like this is what makes sense to me. We have to keep in mind what these people have lived through before we assume that they're just not trying, or that they're just not interested, or that they're, quote, bad kids.
Yeah.
And so I worked with people that were wards of the state who had no option but to either be in that group home or prison, basically. I've had ribs broken. I've had 6 concussions. I've had my car windows broken out. I've had my ankle broken.
Wow, you've worked with
And
some traumatized people.
yeah,
Yeah.
I went back every time because I remembered how hard it was to not have anybody come back for you, and how easy it is for a lot of people to turn away from those challenges and to say, I just don't want to be a part of it, or perhaps it triggers them, which is absolutely fair and respectful. But for me, it felt like I had an opportunity to be someone good to people who have not had much of that. And I wanted to build on that. And so I ran group homes and foster homes. I've worked in specialized schools with individuals with autism, all with aggressive behaviors. And then in 2018, I had been sitting thinking, what am I going to do next? Where am I? I knew I wanted my master's or my doctorate or something more. And I just had fallen in love with the impact this has on family and our children. And I didn't want to be a social worker. I know the turnover is crazy. I know that the second level trauma is intense. The caregiver trauma is intense. You're going to get exposed to a lot of things that I felt like I know myself enough to know that if I have to see these things and I can't do anything about it, it would just be too much as a survivor, especially.
Yeah.
So I went back to school for youth, family, and community sciences, where I learned about how all these things overlap, how our engagement with each other impacts how our community shows up, how important community is, how important it is to have healthy family systems, safe and healthy boundaries, have conversations I never had when I was younger. And so I also have a graduate degree or graduate certificate as a family coach and educator, where I speak with parents on boundaries, how to create safe spaces for your children, how to educate them on emotions, and how to handle, temper tantrums and aggression, really.
Right.
Because that's all that I tell people all the time, all that is communication. It's just not in an ideal way.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so not to excuse aggression when people are older, but for children or for individuals with differences and developmental disabilities, that's often a result of a challenge of, I don't know how to say what I need, or I'm overwhelmed, I'm overstimulated. I've not been taught how to use the right words to tell you, so I'm showing you how I feel. I'm sick to my stomach, but I don't know how to say it, so I'm punching things. So all of those things I learned throughout my career, and I felt like it was a time to be able to use it all as one thing to tell families and parents and systems that none of our worlds exist in a vacuum. None of our lives exist in a vacuum. And if it wasn't for all these systems at play, my experience would have probably gone very differently, as are most people's experiences. If we weren't so quick to target the survivor instead of support the survivor, then I would have a very different outcome. If the system wasn't so quick to say, what were you wearing? What did you do for this to happen to you? Then I probably would have had a very different outcome.
Right.
So I started seeing the macro and micro parts of this, that there's a system at play, as well as social norms, as well as dynamics in families, as well as community trauma, as well as racial trauma. And so when I graduated, I started my own business where I offer training and professional development around trauma.
Perfect.
And most people don't necessarily get it, and it's not something I can live off of yet. But my goal is that when the world wakes up to the fact that trauma is very real, it's historical. Many of us may not know that we lived through trauma, but because just by nature of being Black or brown or being othered, we live trauma because the world's not made for us. I think until we can acknowledge that systematically, that there's a micro and a macrocosm involved here,
Sure.
trauma will continue to be what it is. And so I hope very deeply to help organizations, school systems, police stations, all of the places, especially when they see individuals that are typically marginalized or youth, that we have to be trauma informed. We have to be trauma aware. We have to stop asking kids what's wrong with them and ask them what happened to you. Instead of assuming this child's being bad, how about we say, what's going on at home? Why are they hiding under the desk? Who are they scared of? Why is
Right.
their head down? Did they not sleep last night because mom works 2 jobs and grandma had to take them from mom to the aunt's house? We don't ask any of those questions. We just say, you're being bad, go to the principal's office, you're suspended.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
my goal is for the systems to just start to say, we have not been there for others and we need to do better. And what's that look like, and how can we create frameworks for that to be something that it evolves into?
And there you go. And I agree with you. I think that so many of the troubles that we run into with this come from a lack of understanding one another, or even seeking to try, because it's
Yes,
faster, easier in the moment. Easier, I'm using air quotes here.
absolutely. Yep.
To just suppress it, right? Shut up, sit down, slap you down. I don't want to hear it right now. And, there's always two sides, all that bullshit. But at the end of the day, are we dealing with this effectively or not? Right. And no, we're not.
Right.
We're not. We could do better.
Right.
We can do better.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't, and if somebody is going to sit here and tell me, oh, no, it's all perfect right now, then I'm going to say, well,
Be very wrong.
yeah, sorry, dude. That's not how it is. No, these
Right.
situations are very, very real. And when we talk about marginalized groups and stuff like that, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about groups
Yeah.
who seem to, who kind of, well, there's just more trauma there. you could
Yeah.
say, or more potential for it to exist
Yeah.
because of the conditions and situations that are there. And there are, and you're so right, because there are systemic issues, there are individual issues. It's a multifaceted, as you've come to realize and learn through your studies, as I did through mine, that this is a
Yeah.
complicated, multi-layered, multifaceted situation that requires a multidisciplinary approach. There isn't one group or one person or one group of knowledge that totally gets all of this. It's a
Right.
number of things,
Yeah.
and it requires caring, professional, knowledgeable people who want to change this situation. And it's state by state, it's city by city,
Yep.
it's county by county. I mean, the number of regulations on this, the number of programs on this, the social services available on this are so variable.
Yeah.
There's some mandate from the federal government of, okay, here's how everybody's going to deal with this.
Right.
It's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
So there's so many challenges here, right?
Yeah. And
And,
there's, to your point too, there's so many social norms that play into it.
oh yeah,
Just the mere fact of what one should be doing, or how you quote should act, or what a boy or a male or a female or a should do. Those things play such a huge part in it too. And I tell people often, you know, everybody is having a human experience. And there's nothing unique about male versus female that is unable to say, you know what, you have your experience and that's tough, and I have my experience and that's also tough. So instead of us being angry about it to each other, what can we do to foster conversations, even if they're hard, especially because they're hard? I love hard conversations. I've been fired 4 times because I refuse to not have the hard conversation. And although most people in my life keep telling me, shut up already and just do it and just get the money and go home, as a survivor, when your voice has been taken, once you finally find it, you don't put it back.
that's right.
And so I even have it tattooed on my arm, and it says, speak your truth. And it was from a therapist who was one of 2 therapists who I felt really saved my life. And he died randomly one day. And when he passed, he had given me a list of 3 things to always pay attention to. And the top of that list was speak your truth. And so I have it in his handwriting on my arm. I got it on the anniversary of my assault on Halloween 4 years ago. And it gets me in trouble, but I also think and very much believe that it hopefully allows me to continue to help others find their voice, to help others feel safe, to create spaces where people can feel safe by going in there first, maybe because I'm more healed, because I've recovered a little bit more, and be able to say, people may not be ready yet to have all the conversations, but let's create the space at least to acknowledge there's a conversation to be had.
Yep, there you go. It's always the first step, right?
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. I could not agree with you more about all of that. There's a lot of work we got to do out there, right? There's a lot of people who need help, who need education, who need information about this stuff. And this is the by the way, just in terms of moving towards ending our moving to the end phase of this discussion today. A lot of people might listen to this, or some of you might be listening to this rather, and thinking, well, I thought this was speaking of cults. If you can't connect the dots between everything we're saying so far in cultic activity, right? That's like all of this is speaking of cults, because everything we're talking about, literally everything, including what tragically happened to you, the results of what happened to you, and what you carry from that. This is what happens in cults 24/7, 365. Yep. Right. So I feel silly even having to say that. And maybe, most of y'all out there aren't thinking that, but I just needed to put that out there, because this is what we have been dealing with in cults all this time as well. Right. And domestic violence, cultic leadership, group, gang, trafficking situations. The thing that binds all of them, the thing that is common about all of them, is coercive control.
Yep.
Isolation, manipulation, and control. It's what happened to you. And it
Yeah.
happened in an immediate, it happened over a longer term. You described it perfectly, right? And it's what happens to people in cults. And for those of you who think, well, you can just walk away. Okay, just go quit your job right now. Go ahead. Go show me how easy
Boom.
it is to go walk away from a situation you are so invested in, you can't just walk away,
No.
right? It's like that.
Yeah.
It's like that,
Yeah.
right? So,
And to your point, at the beginning you had asked, what was it? Why did I reach out to you?
mm,
Um, I find cults to be intriguing on 1,000 levels.
yeah,
But as a survivor, I think there's a beauty, honestly, in a survivor is that a survivor is a survivor is a survivor is a survivor. And I only say that as in there's such empathy in these conversations, and there's that feeling of finally being seen that many of us didn't have for so long in our journey, that when I hear about cults, when I hear about these conversations, it puts me kind of at ease because it makes you feel less that it's you're broken or you're dumb that you fell into this, or you should have not taken a drink from a stranger. And instead, knowing statistically, it's like 1 out of 3 women are sexually assaulted in their life. 1 out of 7 individuals identifying male are assaulted in their life. So statistically, it's happening.
yeah,
So
yeah.
just like with cults, statistically, it's happening. And if we don't address it and we don't point at it and say, that's what this is here, then we'll never heal through it. And those of us who experience it will continue to shame ourselves. We'll continue to lose people to suicide, to overdoses, to risky behavior, because that's a very common thing for us is we get in cars with strangers because we don't respect ourselves because you didn't respect us. So who gives a shit anymore?
That's right. That's
And
right.
so as I learned that as a survivor, I could give myself less personal responsibility for why and how I recovered. As I learned about neurology and the fact that our brain is set up a certain way, and that this literally changed my brain chemistry. And now I had to retrain my brain to connect and communicate differently than it was during those systems. If I didn't learn those things, I would continue to tell myself, you shouldn't have, you shouldn't have, you shouldn't have. And as I learn that we are animals, just like other animals, as it relates to fight, flight, fawn, freeze, I'm learning that you survive however it is you survive. Whether it is that you fight the person off, or you just let it happen and hopefully it gets done faster, or you try to appease them and give them what they're asking so maybe they leave you the hell alone. Those are all survivor techniques. Those are what made it so humans get here and last as long as they have.
Right.
And so for me, when I learned that, it was like, oh, okay, this is literally in our DNA. So I'm not broken. I'm not crazy. I'm not all the things that people will tell you or that the social norms tell you. I'm not those things. I am just a human who's living a human experience, handling it in a humanistic way. And once I was able to really accept that, I could finally feel the recovery and the healing and the passing of all of that guilt and that shame that lives here in your throat and in your chest finally started to break up. Finally, I could take big breaths. And I want that for everyone who survives. And I want everyone who's surviving to know it's a bitch. And I'm sick of being told I'm strong. I tell people all the time, I'm sick of it. I would love to not be told, God, it's so impressive how strong you are. Because what that means to me often is, well, at least you've made it through all of that. And all I want to say is, I should have never had to live through that to begin with. You
Exactly.
should have never lived through what you lived through to begin with.
That's right.
So we have to, this is where being trauma aware and trauma informed shows up. Because if we ooh and ah at people's recovery and we go, oh my gosh, how impressive you were able to blah, what that does often for many of us is it just minimizes it. It makes you feel like you're circus animal that makes you feel like, oh wow, look at you. Like, oh, I'm so impressed you were able to get through it.
Oh, aren't you so sweet?
Exactly.
Yeah, that can happen. That can happen. I don't want to take away people's honest feelings of of like recognition
Important.
of
Absolutely.
support, right? But at the same time, no, I definitely pick up what you're putting down. I've experienced some of that myself over the years.
Yeah. So that's why I came to you, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm glad we hit on trauma. I think if people are ready and willing to have those tough conversations, you're vulnerable every time you open up this conversation. And I think for many of us, when I see someone else be vulnerable, I'm far more willing and able to meet them and also be vulnerable, because it just automatically gives you that safe space. It automatically gives you a space to be authentic. And I think often the world just doesn't allow many of us to be our authentic selves. It tells us to calm down or be less than or be smaller than, and be quiet and don't be angry black woman, and all these things that have often come to my especially my professional world, where I wear natural hair, I have a septum piercing, I have tattoos. I address that in every interview I'm in, because the first thing I tell people is, if you don't want all of what you see, then I'm not the right person for you.
Right.
Because I didn't fight through this for 20 years now. It was 20 years this past Halloween to not be myself. And if I was able to get through this, and others are able to get through their trauma and show up at all on the other side, in whatever form that looks like, you shouldn't have to dull down, because you've more than earned, if you will. And I don't like that word. You should have to earn your voice. You have a voice no matter what. But you've more than earned a place at the table and your voice, and to be able to advocate for yourself. And I just think too often, too many people get told to just be less than and to put their light out. And as survivors, when people say that, it makes you think, what is it all for? Like, I could have just ended it 20 years ago and I wouldn't have to go through all of that. And so I just hope that everyone who's listening to this, who is a survivor, knows that they're doing enough, that every day that they wake up, don't judge yourself on what others tell you should be doing. Don't feel like you have to heal the way others heal. That was the hardest part for me. I didn't know healing is not lateral. It
Mm-hmm.
is not straightforward. There's not a clear journey. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
It's some days you feel like you're so much worse off than you were before you started going to therapy.
Oh yeah.
And some days you leave thinking, hell yeah, I could take over the world. And so I just want everyone who survives anything, and most people out there have survived something, to remember that there is a chance for you to be at that table, whatever table it is, whenever you're ready, whenever your bandwidth allows, whenever the space is there, and not to rush it. Because if we rush it, we will just, like you started, we'll just be suppressing just as much as the other people next to us.
Yep.
And then we'll just be worse off than we were.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much for that. Uh,
Yeah.
Wonderful statement there in wrapping this up today. And I want to thank you for being open and transparent about your past and your experiences with this, because it's that kind of thing that helps those out there listening right now to realize their situation and maybe step up. I've had enough emails over enough years doing this
Yeah.
that, and I'm sure you have too, right? Where, when you feel seen and heard or represented in some fashion, right?
Yeah.
It really matters. I didn't used to think it did.
Same.
I really thought
Yeah.
it was just some kind of like, social thing, oh,
Yeah.
representation, right? And then you actually experience it, and I'm not just talking about minority thing. It's a human thing.
Right.
It's a human thing, right? We need to
Yes.
feel seen. We need to feel heard. We need to feel like somebody cares. And I hope that this show today has, served to accomplish that. help to
Yeah.
inform, help to educate a little bit today on some of these basic principles.
Yeah.
So Emily, thank you again.
Thank you. I appreciate the space.
You bet. You bet. Thanks for reaching out to me.
Of
And
course.
and on that happy note, how do people reach you?
Yeah. So I am on LinkedIn. Emily Ragland is probably the best way for me, but I'm also on Instagram. It's M Ragland, EM, and then Ragland. There's two different ones, but one of them's private, so one of them's like my private personal one, and then there's the public one. Um, and yeah, if anyone wants to share a story or discuss, or I offer professional development and training and facilitation around building frameworks in your work environment, especially that are trauma informed. If you're serving people who need support and need advocacy, I think we have an obligation to be trauma informed at the very least, because you can do a lot of harm if you don't educate yourself.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Good. Well, we will have links to those in the show notes. All right,
Awesome.
for everybody to check out. And on that, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much
Sounds
for
good.
coming around, and thanks, audience out there, for coming around and listening to us gabber on at a mad rate about all of this. And I hopefully will see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.